Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. This session is ED 279, Maine's Essential Programs and Services Public School Funding Model. We are here to help you understand that it is not too complicated. It is not crazy. It is, well, it might be crazy. I'm here to help you understand that you can understand it. It really is simple math in many areas, but yes, there is a lot of parts to it, okay? So I'm really happy to have you all here. There are a lot of school board members in the audience. I'm really excited about that. Business managers, superintendents, and others that are interested in the formula. Frankly, everybody in Maine should understand a little bit about how schools are funded because it's a significant portion of our tax dollars. And so therefore, this really is not a hidden formula. I meant to bring my magic 8-ball and I forgot it. We don't calculate funding using magic 8-ball. It really is very specific, but I will say this. All parts impact other parts. So when one thing is changed, other things are impacted. So the presentation that I'm about to show you, as well as some other important documents, have been uploaded into Whova so that you may download them, print them, use them how you see fit. But I've also provided this one, which actually does a line by line of every part of the formula, the calculations, and where all of the data comes from that we use in the formula, which, by the way, the data comes from all of the individual school administrative units in their uploads to the Maine Department of Education, with the exception of a few points of data that I'll explain as we go through the presentation. But there are three major components to the formula: student counts, staff information, and then the financial information. All of that information is uploaded into systems at the department, and that is what we use to calculate the funding level for every SAU every year. We'll start with the Constitution of Maine, of the state of Maine. Legislature shall require towns to support public schools, and then it goes into what the duty of the legislature is. Article 8 of the Maine Constitution indicates that the towns are responsible for a free and public education for all students in the state of Maine. And then the Maine Department of Education has been charged with helping the towns. So ultimately, the responsibility is on the towns, and then the state assists with that as best we can. To come to that end, Maine has adopted what we call the Essential Programs and Services Funding Model. It is in statute in Chapter 606B of Title 20A, which are the education statutes. Every part of the formula is in statute. That means when you want to change a part of the formula, it has to go through a legislative process to change statute. So some of you may wonder, why can't things be changed easier or quicker, or by a letter to the commissioner saying this seems wrong? Well, that's why. It's a statutory requirement, and then we have to go through the process. However, that being said, it's not impossible. And it is reviewed every few years in legislature. Every component of this formula is reviewed per statute, and then reports are done, and we'll talk about that too in a minute. So why EPS? Prior to the implementation of EPS, the funding model in Maine was using a traditional approach to determine education needs in terms of revenue. In other words, whatever dollars are available, divide them in such a way to ensure there were equal education dollars between each child. Well, equal isn't necessarily equitable. And so the EPS model will focus on student outcomes, Maine's learning results, and then on the services and resources needed to achieve them. In other words, the term essential programs and services, what is essential in order that all students will have the opportunity, the same opportunity, no matter where they live in the state, to have the opportunity again to achieve Maine's learning results. That is the point of the formula. Secondly, it defines what is adequate in terms of resources and dollars to provide the education necessary for each child. So there's two parts to the formula. The first part is calculating, okay, based on these essential programs and services that we believe are necessary so that every child has the same opportunity no matter where they live. The second part is distributing state funds so that the funds are going to those that need it, perhaps need more, and then less funds from the state to those that may not need it as much, depending on their local ability to contribute towards education. Because just like most funding that comes from government, whether it's federal or state, there is a state and local share. In order to receive the state portion, there is a required local share. That local share and state share for this funding model is going to be different depending on where you live and depending on your ability to contribute using local tax dollars. A minute ago, I said there's a difference between equal and equitable. I really like this image of, it kind of explains it really well. The formula is, as I mentioned, a mechanism for establishing a minimum sufficient funding. The formula was never intended to determine the total cost of education in your district. We wouldn't be able to do that in your school administrative unit. We wouldn't have the ability to do that. We don't know what you need. It's a local control state. You determine what you need. However, the formula is set up to determine, okay, what is the minimum any student, no matter where they live, would need? So it really is a minimum sufficient funding level. It isn't expected to cover the entire cost. That's where your additional local comes in many places. It's also set up, as I mentioned, to determine an equitable way to distribute the funding responsibility between local and local communities and the state share. So in this picture, if you look at the apples and consider that the apples represent the minimum level of education each child in Maine should have the opportunity to achieve. That's what we want them to be able to reach. Now, that being said, the ability to reach higher apples should be better. Everybody should want to. But the minimum, so that everybody has the opportunity to succeed, are the low-hanging fruit. But as you see, not everyone can reach that. So the boxes represent the state contribution to education at each individual SAU level. Equality means we give every SAU, every child, the same amount of money, no matter where they start out. But then, as you can see, not every child is still able to reach that low-hanging fruit of the minimum requirements. The people represent the town's fiscal ability to contribute towards education. At this time, the only option is property tax. Not saying that's best. I understand, believe me, mine went up this year as well. However, that's what we're using because we don't really have another way of doing it. We'll talk about that later. I understand median income. We're working on figuring all that out. But right now in statute, the way we do it is using property tax values for your town, which, by the way, we get from Maine Revenue Services. We'll talk about that later as well. So if the boxes represent the fiscal capacity, ability to contribute towards education using local property taxes, some towns are able to contribute more than others, right? The taller person, the boxes aren't the boxes of the state, the people are the town. Some towns are taller and have a higher ability to collect property taxes, whereas other towns don't have as much. So the point of the equality model that EPS is doing is to say if you have higher ability as a town to collect taxes toward education, we're going to give you less of the state funding because it's very limited in how much we have available. We have one pot of money that we have to distribute to all SAUs. Then we can give more to the other towns that need more in order that all students are able to reach at least that minimum level of education. Does that all make sense to everybody? That's the point. I'm not going to tell you it's perfect the way it's done. It's not, and we're reviewing it, and we review it every year. But I'm telling you that that's the purpose and that's the point of why it's set up the way it is. EPS is designed to ensure that all schools have the programs and resources that are essential for students to have the opportunity to achieve Maine's learning results. It was designed to respond to student needs and is based on years of research and information gleaned from high-performing, cost-effective school units. Again, in order to receive state subsidy, SAUs must contribute the required local amount of the EPS calculation, which is different for every town. And as I mentioned also, many SAUs do raise above and beyond what the state requires for the local share, and that is referred to additional local, which is where your cost sharing comes in. That's all of the additional local over and above what EPS has calculated. I think I've already discussed most of these bullets. It does establish a monthly state payment schedule. The calculation for funding, we are required to have the next year's allocation report available and ready for you by February 1st of every year. We try very hard on our little 8-person team to have everything ready, but before that, ED 279 report. Is there anyone in here who does not know what an ED 279 report is? Excellent. Okay. We are about to go through the ED 279 report. This is the report that shows for your specific school administrative unit exactly what is calculated for funding for that fiscal year, school year, for your school administrative unit, for your SAU. On each page, which is what we're about to go through, I'm about to teach you exactly what it is and what the formula is. It shows you how the formula is done and exactly the data we used that was uploaded from your SAU in order for us to calculate the formula. So each page represents attending counts, staff, subsidy counts, which are those that you are fiscally responsible for educating resident students in your SAU. And then the other subsidizable costs, which are your special education, your transportation, if you have construction aid, debt service that is state funded. All of those things are part of the report every year. And these are available, by the way, for SAU, because we calculate individual SAU. We don't just calculate and then distribute. We calculate based on every SAU and every student. They are available publicly on the DOE's website for you to look at, download, print, and we have available all the way back to years 2014, FY 2014. Not only can you go in publicly and download your SAU, your school administrative unit's ED 279, you can download others. So if you want to, anybody, all of them are available, all 266 school administrative units. ED 279 report is available for each year on the website. You can download your neighbor or somebody you think is similar, and you can compare their data and their calculations with yours. You can see then that the formula is the same for everybody, but the data is different. That's because your counts are different, your staff are different. And so the formula is actually very interactive in that it's not the same for everybody in that it's the same formula, but your data is different because you have a different number of students. You have different staffing levels. So it's very specific to your SAU. It does not take away local control. Who here would like to give away local control? Yeah, I didn't think so. Local control is very important, and it should be. You're going to know what your students in your district need more than we're going to know. We are not here to tell you how to educate your students. Well, I'm not. The formula is not. I'm just going to put that caveat out there. We are not here to tell you how many teachers you should have. So if you think on the 279 where it says you need this many teachers or this many ed techs, that's not what that's there for. We're not telling you you should only have this many teachers. We're telling you this is how many the formula is going to fund you at based on the number of students you have to get you to that minimum level of required funding. Does that make sense? We'll get deeper into that in a minute. It's not telling you how to spend your money, by the way. We give you a lump sum. Other than those couple of targeted lines, you can use it how you see fit. You do not have to spend it on the things that we've calculated that you should have available to spend, if that makes sense. Let me try that again. I'm getting confused looks. We're going to give you $1 million. How you budget that $1 million is up to you. We're not telling you how to budget it. We're telling you this is what the funding level will be from the state based on this EPS calculation. How you use that money is up to you. That's what you do in your budget process. That's what you and your business manager, your superintendent, and the whole school board, that's your job locally. We are, however, funding you at a certain number of staff that has been determined to be a sufficient level for the essential programs and services in order that all students have the opportunity to achieve Maine's learning results. You may hear me say that a couple times. In FY25, when we calculated the total cost of all of the 266 school administrative units cost using the EPS formula, it came out to $2.6 billion total cost. The state contributed 55% of that. That's the pecan pie, or pecan. Then that left, for 45%, $1.1 billion for the locals to contribute. That was FY25. The mill rate at that time was 6.62. In FY26, the current school year, the total cost went from $2.6 billion to $2.7 billion. So that's a significant jump in 1 year. But of course, you all understand, costs are going up, right? So when the state contributed its 55%, $1.5 billion was the state share for the total cost. And then $1.2 billion is the local share. The mill rate went down to 6.1. It's not 55% of your budget. It's not 55% of individual school administrative unit calculations. It's 55% of the total cost of education per the EPS formula. What's used in the formula? Student data. This is October. Your schools are extremely busy right now collecting an enormous amount of data that we use in the calculation. We need them to be completed with that data collection by October 31st. Why? Because we then have 2 weeks to calculate funding, or to determine, 2 weeks to review all the data that was given and look for anomalies that may be wrong and reach out to every individual SAU to say, hey, this doesn't look right, are you sure it's right? Because we want to make sure the calculation is correct. Then after that, we have 2 weeks to come up with what is the total cost, and then what is the mill rate, and then what does the state need to contribute, and give that to our Bureau of Budget, because the governor is already waiting for us to give them the amount for the budget that they needed a month ago. So we have a very short period of time on my little 8-person team to collect all of this data for 68,000 students in order to calculate the funding for everybody and determine, okay, where are we this year and what does the formula say we need? This impacts not only your local taxes, but the taxes you pay to the state, because where does that 55% state share come from? Our taxes, right? So it's important that we get it right. I'm saying that because we care and we want it to be right, and we are careful in the data mining and review that we do, and so we ask for all of you, your SAUs, to be careful in the data that they submit and ensure that it's accurate. Extremely important. So the student data, we look at attending students, we look at resident students, which I call subsidizable. The formula calls it subsidizable. Those are the ones that you receive subsidy for and that you're required to pay for, whether they live in your district, they're residents, or they're attending your districts on a superintendent agreement. You get the subsidy count, if that's the case. This also takes into account equivalent instruction students, those that may be taking a class in your school, but they're homeschooled. Those are counted as well. You receive some funding for them. Economic disadvantaged students, this is the most important factor right now in the collection of student data, because ultimately there are 2, possibly 3 areas of the formula that are impacted by your economic disadvantaged student counts. And so it's extremely important that this data is collected. English multilingual learners, there's additional funding for them. Additional funding for special ed students. We are collecting the CTE enrollment for anyone that has a CTE center or the regions, those are a separate calculation. So we're collecting those enrollments too for that funding that comes out of the state. Pre-K. For pre-K students, there's additional funding in the formula for pre-K up to grade 2 because the younger students tend to need more services. There's additional funding for that. For any of you who are in a cohort 1 or cohort 2, for the pre-K special ed CDS FAPE transition. Who's heard of that? All right. Who knows that their SAU is part of that right now? Okay. So all of you are going to have to be part of it by 2028. There is a statute that requires it. It's not an unfunded mandate. That is pulled out of EPS, not part of this formula at all. For 3, 4, and 5-year-olds that are in pre-K with an IEP. And that is 100% funded by the state, per statute. That's why it's pulled out of EPS, because EPS has a state and local share. That doesn't. So that includes 3-year-olds with special ed needs, with IEPs. Staff data, by October 30, we need to understand the staff data. Budget data, that's the third piece. The actual expenditures from quarter 4 of 2025. Okay, we are about to calculate FY27. We're in 26 now. For the expenditure data that we use in the formula related to special ed, transportation, etc., those things on page 3 of the report, we have to use 2-year-old data, technically. Really, right now, it's 1-year-old data. It's from last year that we're collecting to use. Why can't we use this year's expenditure data? It's not done yet, right? So, yeah, if you hear the rumor, oh, they're using 2-year-old data. Well, we have no choice. We have to calculate next year's funding now, so you have it for your budget time next March. And the only one we have available is FY26, that just 25, excuse me, that just ended. So that is why it's 2-year-old data. Okay, now we're going to get into the detail of the ED 279 report. They're public reports. Section 1, the per pupil cost to operate a school for regular education, not special ed, used as a multiplier in Section 2. If you don't operate a school, you're not going to see any numbers on that except your EPS rate. And that is determined by where the students that live in your district attend school. Okay? Section 2, operating costs for all subsidizable students with additional weights. Section 3, all your other subsidizable costs, that's where special ed comes in. None of the staff on page 1 should ever include a special ed staff person, because that is not what the formula is calculating for. It's only general education, not special education. That is something we go back and check with your data people often to ensure that they haven't mistakenly added special ed staff, because that could impact the funding. Page 4 is where we determine what is the state share, what is the local share. Page 5 is some additional adjustments as necessary. And then 6 is your checkbook. You can go in every month and see what we've paid you and what you're expected to get paid in your SAU every month for the entire year. And here's where you can find the reports. This is all public. If any of you want to download these documents, again, they are in Hoover. You can go to this page. You click on the year you want to look at, 2026, all the way down to 2014. You can go back as that far. Choose whatever SAU you want to view. And then click View Report. It will pull it up. Once you've viewed it, you're only going to see page 1. And some people are like, where's the rest of the report? Well, the web only gives you 1 page at a time, and there are arrows. However, there is an export button. I recommend export to PDF, and then you have it all there. You can save it, you can print it, you can scroll through all the pages. Utilize the export button. Magic 8-ball, again, I told you I was going to bring it, but I forgot it. We do not actually use the 8-ball, I promise you. Section 1, per pupil cost rates. So, this is looking at elementary and secondary per pupil costs. We look at the number of students attending. We look at your staff. The actual staff in your schools for general education only, remember? What is their years of experience? What is their level of education? Why is that important? Because we use the same average salary matrix for all of the staff for every SAU in the state. And the matrix looks at the level, years of experience, level of education, and that is the amount of funding the formula will allocate towards your SAU for that staff member. So every individual staff member and their data is an important component in the formula. This is a copy of the salary matrix. That also is available on our website every year. So you can see the amounts that are used in the formula for funding for teachers, guidance counselors, social workers, and librarians. They have the same matrix. Ed techs and library techs. We have school administrators, which are principals and assistant principals. That's the only one that's a little different. That one actually is dependent, the funding is dependent upon how many students are in your school. So it's less funding if you have 1 to 124 students, more funding if you have more than 1,000 students as an allocation of funding for them. Then we have clerical staff based on years of experience, and health staff based on years of experience. That's how those are determined. So that's why each individual staff member and the data collected is extremely important to have it correct. And it puts you below the FTE. Here it is. It puts you below the FTE. We will fund you more because you're going to get funded for that staff member because EPS says you need it even if you don't have it. Here's a specific example. The librarian. According to EPS, you're going to be funded, this district will be funded for 2.66 librarians. Their actual staff is 1, which is fine. That's what they've decided they need, 1 librarian. However, if we look at the actual staff member in our matrix, the amount of funding would be $76,000. But because EPS is going to fund at 2.66, which is 1.66 more, the funding is actually going to be $203,000 for librarians. Do you see that? So you don't need to fill an empty position if it's empty. That's not what you should do. That is incorrect. We will fund you for the additional if it's needed and you don't have it. The difference to that, I will show while we're here, is if you have more than what EPS is going to fund you at, for instance, guidance, this district will be funded at 6.84 for the number of students they have. They have 9 actual. So their actual came out in the matrix to 557,000. We're going to reduce that by the percentage over to 423,000 because that's the funding level EPS will give. We've been talking about how it uses student counts. Page 1 is all about attending. The students that are attending, they're sitting in a seat, in a school, in a classroom, in your SAU. If you don't operate a school, so you don't have attending counts, page 1 will not show numbers for students and they won't show numbers for staff, but it will show an EPS rate. Page 1 is where we determine what is the EPS rate. The EPS rate is not a per pupil allocation amount for your school. It's a per pupil multiplier because it's the per pupil amount as determined by the EPS formula for the cost of operating a school in your district with your students that are attending and your staff and where they land in the salary matrices. Okay, so it's a per pupil cost of operating for general ed only, not special ed. That per pupil cost determined on page 1 for general ed is the multiplier for your school administrative unit on page 2, section 2 of the ED 279 report. Page 2, because we use that multiplier on page 2, and it's different for every SAU, obviously, and that is where, page 2 is where we start the allocation of actual funding that you're going to use to either operate schools in your district or pay tuition for those that you send outside of your district, those are where the counts for your resident students, you're fiscally responsible for educating those students, that's where you see those. That is where we use that multiplier from page 1 to determine an amount of funding. If you have 250 students, your per pupil rate is $8,000. Multiply that, that's one line. That's also where we add additional funding for those students that you are fiscally responsible for, subsidy students we call them, subsidizable. That's also where we add the additional weighted funds for those that are considered economically disadvantaged, multilingual learners, earlier pre-K to K2 education, all of those additional funds. That's also where we allocate funding towards those targeted programs, such as assessments that are required, and the laptop program, technology. That's where that is. So page 1 is all about, okay, what is the cost of educating students in your SAU, literally in your schools that you operate, okay? And that is using the number of students attending in your district. So if you have students that are going elsewhere, they are not in this count. If you have students that attend in your school that are from a different SAU and they pay you tuition, you will see them on page 1. They will be counted here because they're attending. They are literally sitting in a seat in your school that you operate. Okay? Understand the difference between the two counts? Page 1 is attending. Page 2, resident or subsidy. The other part of this is where we add in percentages for your benefits for your staff. Remember, we talked about how many staff are funded based on FTEs, student to staff ratios. The formula will fund a certain number of staff based on how many attending students you have. That's where the funding comes and goes, okay? That's how we calculate it, because remember, we're calculating now for next year for you, and we have to have it done by February 1st so that you can do your budgeting. If we were to get a count every month or even every quarter for 266 school administrative units and then recalculate, we can't do that. We also have to know for budgeting purposes for the state, how much are we allocating? We have to set that aside in the budget. So it's October 1st. That is the date that we use. We do use a 2-year average. So if you are gaining students, which is rare these days, but if you're losing students, the 2-year average helps to relieve some of that burden. And as I mentioned briefly earlier, if you are losing over 10% in 1 year of your students, it does a 3-year average if that helps you. If it doesn't help you, we don't use the 3-year average. So the other part of this, there are 8 levels of staff: teachers, which includes classroom teacher, literacy specialist, long-term substitute, Title I teacher, and multilingual learner teacher for general ed. Remember, this is not special ed. Guidance, which includes your school social worker, your director of guidance, and your guidance counselor, or school counselor, or whatever they're called. That's what this includes. Librarians, health, can be a nurse, can be telehealth, can be whatever you use. Ed techs, library techs, clerical. Clerical are at the school level building. So these are administrative staff that at the school level. Remember, this is what does it cost to operate a school, not administrative level. So if your administrative staff are not part of this particular funding level, because this is what is the cost to operate a school, and then it's your multiplier. So administrative, district level administrative assistants are not going to be part of this. In order for them to be part of this, they need to be at the school level, okay? And then school admins, which are your principal, assistant principal, and teaching principal. Those are the staff. These are the staffing levels. Your 279 report does show, and I realize this is very small, but it does show what the FTE, student to staff ratios are that are used in the formula. There are different levels. They're split out by pre-K to K, grades 1 to 5, grades 6 to 8, and then grades 9 to 12. For example, ed techs, they are actually 800 to 1 across the board for every level at this time. These are all things that can be adjusted in statute through statutory changes. This is what they are at this time in statute, which again, Chapter 606B, Title 20A, if you want to read it, it's great reading. I don't think I said, but I do try to keep the fun in funding. So again, you can see all of the levels, and then specifically on your report, it will show you how much that means you're going to be allocated funding for in the formula, depending on how many students you have. And it uses the 2-year average. So for instance, the pre-K to K student, 220. So this line for teachers, it would take 15 divided into 220. The math is 14.67. That's what the funding is for teachers for that level. And then do the math all the way across for 1 to 5 based on the 2-year average, and the total teacher line for this district for funding in the EPS formula is 129.38 FTEs. Then we compare it to what the actual teachers are in regular education for pre-K to 8 for this particular school, or district, I should say. It's the school administrative unit. It's not at the school level, which I mentioned earlier. It's at the SAU level. All the schools, doesn't matter how many you have. Then we say, okay, APS is going to fund for 129.38. They actually have 127.1. The amount for this in the salary matrix for the actual comes to 7.6 million. We're going to increase it a little because they're a little short on what EPS is going to fund them at. The increase uses in the matrix the average salary for each level, because we don't know how many years of experience or what their level of education is going to be for somebody who's actually not in the position. So we use the average. But we're going to fund you for that position because we believe that is what, I shouldn't say we believe, because that is what the funding level is set at. So you will be funded even if you don't have staff in the position if you're below, okay? So then the additional funding is provided in this case, and then we split it for elementary and secondary by the percentage of students that are elementary and secondary. So that is where the split comes in. If you add the elementary and secondary, you will come up with the adjusted EPS salary. Again, this is the matrix. I've shown it earlier. It's available online. If you're not sure how to find it, reach out to any of us on my team and we will help you. This level is where we show that we're still on page 1. Computation of benefits. We take teachers, guidance, librarian, and health. They are added, benefits are added for them at 26%. Benefits are added for ed techs and library techs at 40%, clerical at 40%, and school administrators at 21%. Why the different percentages? That is what was, so MEPRI, Maine Education Policy Research Institute, every 3 years examines every single component of the formula, looks at what the actual payments are around the state, comes back and says, here's what the percentages are and should be, makes recommendations as to whether or not we are hitting the mark as close as we could be for the whole state with what we have. Sometimes they recommend changes, sometimes they recommend that we're okay. Either way, the changes, if there are changes recommended or the report indicates that we're close, it still has to go through the legislative process to change these because they're all in statute. So, does that make sense? All the reports are available after they are presented to the Ed Committee, to the legislature, and we can help you find those as well, that MEPRI puts out. But the different percentages are based on the fact that apparently these staffing have different percentages in the real world. The attempt is to mimic as much of the real world as we can, as much of the field as we can, without being able to do it exactly the way every individual SAU does it, keeping in mind we need to do it for the entire state at a level that is adequate and hopefully fits into an average salary and benefit scale. Then we add in other support. There are other supports that are necessary in order to operate a school for general education. That includes substitute teachers, supplies and equipment, professional development, instructional leadership, co- and extracurricular student activities. Some people say, well, that's not included. Well, it is, actually. It's part of page 1. System administration, that's superintendents, business managers, operations and maintenance. And those are all per pupil amounts that are also determined in statute. Most of those, except for the system admin support, are updated every year, again, just like the salary matrix, by the inflation factor. So every year, even if there are no changes at the levels that they are in statute, they increase by an inflation factor to try to keep up with inflation the best we can. I will say this about the inflation factor. That is also in statute, and for EPS, we are limited in the inflation amount that we use. We cannot use an inflation amount greater than a 2-year average of CPI. So we are limited in what we can use there per statute. So there are parameters to every aspect of the formula that we are required to abide by per statute. The other thing on here that has had a lot of attention, and should, is the regional adjustment. After we've done all of this work using average salaries across the state, we know that there are areas that pay more than our matrix, because that's an average salary matrix, and we know there are areas that pay less. The cost of living is higher in some and lower in others. We understand that. So the regional index is designed, and has been designed since the formula was put into effect in FY6. So we are in our 20th year. So these regional indexes were designed using labor market areas, 35 labor market areas from, at the time, these are what the labor market areas were. I will say that this has not been updated since FY6, and we know that. There have been attempts to update it over the years, but it has to go through legislative process, and for whatever reason, the updates have not been put through. Ultimately, it's likely because the updates will shift things dramatically. What this does is, if you are at 1, the calculation on page 1 doesn't change. If you're below 1, indicating you're in a labor market area that does not cost as much and does not pay as much, then we will reduce it by whatever the factor is in your area. If you're above 1, we will increase because you're in a more expensive area. All of this is based on FY6 data. It needs to be updated. It is one of the things, if you've heard of LD 318, it is one of the areas that the legislature, the Ed Committee, has asked for MEPRI and the Department of Education to do a deep dive right now into, to say, okay, what can we do to make this better? And so that is being studied as we speak. There is a report that is supposed to be coming out in January to the Ed Committee. I do not know exactly what that report is going to say at this time. Obviously, we are in the middle of examining this. Here's the hard thing. When we change this, there are some that are going to lose money in the formula, and there are some that are going to gain money in the formula. And that's the hard part. You don't ever want to see anybody lose. You want to be able to give to everybody as much as you can, and that's where it makes it tough, because our funding is limited, and we have to find a way to make it equitable and accurate as possible. So we're working on it, I promise you. In the meantime, we have to go by what statute says, and statute has us using these. At the time, the data was from '05. At the time, the 1 was Rockland. That was considered the average labor market area in the state. I know, everybody's looking, Rockland, really? I know. So I'm just showing you. This is exactly what we're using, and I'm explaining to you why. I'm being transparent. I promise you nothing in this formula is hidden from you. It's all available. And if you don't understand it, I am available to help you understand it better. That's what this session is about. There are no secrets. And if you think there are some secrets, I'm going to tell you what they are, because I don't keep secrets. So that's where that comes in, the labor market areas. So this last line is either adding funding or reducing funding. And when I say funding, I don't mean that. This isn't where funding is allocated. This is where the multiplier is determined. So we add up all the costs that we've accumulated, the funding levels from these prior things. And then at the end we say, okay, if your regional index is 0.95, we're going to reduce it by 0.05. Okay? If your index is 105, we're going to increase it. So if you have a negative amount here, your index is below 1. If you have a 1 index, nothing will change. If you have above a 1, you'll see a positive amount here. Then we take the total that we've accumulated of funding for elementary and secondary. We divide it by your 2-year average attending students. That is your per pupil EPS rate. That is then used as the multiplier on page 2. The regional index is only on salaries. We do not remove, is that another slide? No. We only apply the index to salaries. So it's only applied to this top section where the salaries come in for staff. The benefits? Yes. Yes, the benefits. And then only the substitute line is included in that as well. That's page 1. Page 1, we've determined what is the cost to operate a classroom in your SAU. Real quick, if you don't operate schools, whether it's pre-K to 12 or it's secondary, the way that we determine your EPS rate, you still have to have an EPS rate, but you don't have staff and you don't have attending students, so we can't do it the traditional way. We look at where your students are actually attending, which is, again, something that's collected right now. Where are they attending? If they're attending multiple places, we take the EPS rate that was determined for the SAU where they're attending if it's a public school. If it's a private school, we use the average state EPS rate. And then we come up with, based on the students and where they're attending and how many, a weighted average EPS rate for the SAU, so that you have a multiplier on page 2 that is indicative of where they're actually attending. Page 2, section 2, is the subsidizable counts. Students whose parents or legal guardians reside in the SAU. It is also students who have been handed over for the year, let's say, on a superintendent agreement. So where they live has agreed to give you their subsidy count for that student for the year, because they're attending your SAU, and instead of them paying you tuition, they've said, we're going to turn the kid over. You've both agreed. A superintendent agreement has to be agreed upon by both SAUs. The sending superintendent and the receiving superintendent must agree. If one of them doesn't, then it doesn't happen. Superintendent agreement moves the child count for subsidy to the receiving district, SAU. So this count is either those that live in your SAU or those that are there on a superintendent agreement. We call it subsidizable. The first level here are basic counts. We just take what are the 2-year average, except pre-K counts are not 2-year average. Statute says for pre-K, it is just the most recent count, which kind of makes sense if you think about it. Pre-K is the first time they're in school. So just the most recent count is what we use in the formula for pre-K. K to 8, it's a 2-year average. So the first line, basic counts, what is the number, times the EPS rate. EPS rate from page 1 for elementary, EPS rate from page 2, multiplication, we all learned that, right? Literally, that simple. You can take a calculator, come up with the same number. If you don't, give me a call, there's something wrong. Then we have adult ed counts. These are 16 to 20-year-olds that have dropped out of school. However, they are taking adult ed classes in order to get their high set, right term? Yes. I'm really learning a lot about programs that I never knew because, again, I'm the number person. So if they've dropped out and they're taking adult ed, you get counts for that as well. That is collected on what's called the EFM 39A and B report. Doesn't matter where they're taking classes, you get the count, you get the allocation. That's a whole nother story. We don't have time for that today. Next are your equivalent instruction. Remember I mentioned that. Those are homeschool students that are taking 1 or 2 classes in your SAU. They are enrolled this time of year and counted for whatever percentage of classes they're taking. So you get a count for them. Then down here we have the weighted counts, your disadvantaged percentage. In this case, it's 45.3%. 45%, I believe this is Augusta, that we're using as an example. They have about a 45% based on the collection of the data. This is always somebody's favorite topic. How do we determine economic status? I'm going to go through it really quickly, but deeper questions we're going to have to wait. In the formula, the definition of economic status back in FY6, when it first started, they wanted to make it simple. Let's use a count that we're already collecting. What were we always collecting back in the day? Free reduced lunch, right? Everybody that was able applied for free reduced lunch. So the definition in EPS is those economic disadvantaged students are those that are eligible for free or reduced lunch. That's the definition. Thinking, okay, use the same collection they're doing for this federal lunch program. Things changed. CEP, sorry. CEP schools came up. Community eligible provision. And provision 2, nutrition, federal. This is not nutrition or federal. EPS was never designed for feeding kids. This is educating, okay? Federal is all about feeding kids. However, they made changes, and then we're like, whoa, we need this data for economic status every year. But now they're not collecting those forms every year. What are we going to do? Well, so we said, okay, first of all, we're looking for a different way. I'm just going to say that up front. We're looking for a better way so we don't have to collect any data to determine what economic disadvantaged student status looks like. We are researching it. That's another part of LD 318. We haven't gotten there yet. So in statute, we still need you to do this. So we came up with an alternate form. It's literally called the alternate economic status form. It is only for purposes of determining status for EPS. It cannot be used for lunch. It cannot be used for any federal program, or at this time, even any other state program. It's only for EPS purposes right now. So that one, you may have heard, some people have heard, you can't send out any form if you're a CEP or a Provision 2 school. That's not exactly true. You can't send out the federal nutrition form, but you can and should send out the alternate economic status form. It cannot be done by your lunch team. Your nutrition federal people cannot do this. It has to be others, okay? So your nutrition people are saying, I can't do that, and they can't. They're federal. This is not, okay? Should you send this even if you send out the free and reduced lunch form? Yes, please. Because there are a lot of people that don't want to. They're like, I don't need free lunch, or I won't qualify. Well, that's okay for lunches. This is for funding, for state funding, for subsidy, for education purposes only. So, and it's simpler form. We made it much simpler, much easier. So please see if you can get as many people to do this one as you can. That being said, it's October 24. Well, you got 6 days. See what you can do. And the reason I say it, disadvantaged, is on here 6 times on page 2, and then another time on page 5 if you're considered a minimum contributor. It's an important data point, okay? We determine economic status basically in 3 ways. First is direct certification. You don't have to do anything for that one. Direct certification are those students that are certified directly because of the data we get from DHHS. They send it to us. As of October 1, here are your students that are eligible for SNAP, TANF, Maine Care eligible. All those are directly certified. We already know them. They're economically disadvantaged in your system. The second, free and reduced lunch. If you send those and get those, that's the other way. They will be entered in the system. And the third is the alternate economic status form. Okay? Again, we're trying to find a different way. Then we have multilingual learners. And somebody asked the different levels earlier. If you have 1 to 15, the weight is 0.7. 16 to 250, it's 0.5. 251 or more, it's 0.525. Just a little bit of a difference in the weights, mainly because of economies of scale for the lower enrollment schools. So for these, we have the percentage, which determines a number of pupils. It's the percentage of pupils from up here that are disadvantaged. We add another weight. Take those pupils times 0.15 for the economic disadvantaged times the EPS rate. There's an allocation of funding. Down here, disadvantaged, again, 0.05. So altogether, your disadvantaged weight is 20%. An additional 20% for those that are, for your percentage of economic disadvantaged students of funding, on top of your already base rate. Multilingual, it's the amount of multilingual times whatever your level is here, times the EPS rate, there's the funding level. Okay? Down here is where we have our targeted funds. Assessment has a per pupil amount. Technology, per pupil amount, and those are increased every year according to the inflation factor. And then you have pre-K and K to 2. They have an additional allocation of 10%. So this is where the funding for, again, general education is for all your pupils. We've come to 19 million. We haven't even started on special ed, transportation, or any of that yet. Okay, so, before I leave this page, Augusta isn't eligible for this, but this is also where, if you are an isolated and small school, you would see the additional adjustment here in section E. So isolated means for elementary, you're at least 8 miles away from the next elementary school. But you need to be isolated and small. So there's a level of I forget what the numbers are. We have it in one of the documents that we've made available to you on Hoover. For secondary, it's fewer than 200 students per school. So this one does look at schools, by the way. This is applied for individual schools. This is the one line in the formula that looks at the actual school. So 200 students per school, fewer than 200 students per school for secondary, and at least 18.5 miles from the nearest high school. So that's for secondary. And elementary is fewer than 15 students per grade and more than 8 miles. More than 8 miles. Okay, so we're at 19.7 million. Now we're going to get to section 3, which is additional operating cost allocations. This is where gifted and talented, special education, high cost out of district special education, transportation, approved bus purchases, those that are through the state approval process, teacher retirement, and then debt service. Approved gifted and talented. All of these, by the way, have a component that is expenditure driven. So it's extremely important that your business manager is properly coding all of your expenditures, because we will be using your expenditure files that are uploaded into our financial system to calculate your allocation. The special ed model is also a mini formula that looks at your special ed student counts and the expenditures. So it's a combination of the two. The transportation operating, that looks at expenditures. All of these are being reviewed, by the way, in LD 318 right now. Okay? Teacher retirement, normalized cost, that comes directly from Maine PERS. So whatever they have received from you, they give to us, and that's where that number comes from. We do not manipulate it. We do not collect it. We get it from them. So if there's a question about whether that's accurate, we will have to refer you to them, to Maine PERS. Debt service. Oh, actually, let me go back to buses. Buses. If you decide to purchase a bus using the bus purchase program, the contact is Cheryl Brackett right now on the transportation team. She does that process. What happens is it's a 3-year process. Year 1, like right now, you say, okay, I would like to apply for a bus. If she says, yes, you meet the criteria and there's enough funding, because funding is limited to $12 million a year for buses. So Cheryl is the one who says yes or no based on criteria that she has. In the 2nd year, you buy the bus. And then in the 3rd year, you receive subsidy in the form of an allocation on page 3. So that means that it's also subject to your state local share. It also means it's not a reimbursement. So if you're buying a bus for $60,000, and we put in $60,000, that's your approved amount on your allocation. If you are a 40% state receiver, what are you going to get? 40% of $60,000. The locals are covering the other part. So when you go to your board, or when your board is asking questions about buying a bus, and they say, how much is the state going to reimburse us? What's the first thing you say? The state doesn't reimburse us. This is not a reimbursement model. It's an allocation of funding. And even though we will put the amount that you've been approved for to purchase the bus as an allocation, it has a state share, but it also has a local share. That's something that's often misunderstood, so I wanted to take a minute on that. Same with, debt service allocations are for principal and interest payments if you have a state-approved construction project, major construction project, not local. None of your local-only debt service is included on the 279, ever. So if you have any local-only, it's literally local-only, okay? Never included on the 279. Only state-funded construction is on the 279. Okay? There's also instructional space leases, those modulars. So the first 15% of your identified special ed population is going to be allocated at an additional 1.5. So for instance, if you download this, okay? This is in that document. If there are 315 students, we multiply those 315 times your EPS base rate, which is different for special ed, so I'm not going to get into that. It's not the same EPS rate on page 1, a whole nother level. That's a whole nother clinic, by the way. Times 1.5, up to 15%, okay? So in this example here, there are 2,097 identified. The first 15% is 315. So they get the 1.5 multiplier. Any students identified above that, above the first 15, get the 0.38 multiplier. So basically the formula is set up right now that the first 15% get 1.5. Beyond that, the next 85, the 85% remaining get a 0.38. And yes, that is being reviewed. At the time when this was created, I will tell you this, the average across the country and in Maine was 15% identification. That has changed. We know that. We recognize that. And we are, I promise you, looking into it. But yes, that is how it is determined at this time. Yes. Thank you, Donna. All right, so section 3 looks like this. Gifted and talented. Oh, gifted and talented is based on your expenditures compared to your budget. So this is where your budget upload comes in. Right now we are looking at FY26. What was your FY26 budgeted amount for gifted and talented? No, sorry. For FY27, we are looking at FY25. Okay. In FY25, what did you upload for your budget for gifted and talented? And then we're looking, okay, what did you actually spend? And we're going to give you the lower of the two. Increased by an inflation factor because it's last year's expenditures. Okay? So, for all of these, for Augusta, they do have a school that is state funded, Coney High School. So their total now, when we add these to what we had on the previous page, we're up to 31.1 million. So for their students, this is the total cost, 31 million for Augusta per the EPS formula. It's not what they spent. It's what the EPS formula believes is an adequate cost of education. Some of it is based on actual expenditures. As I said, page 3 is mostly actual expenditures. But this is the cost that we're using in the formula. Now that we have a total cost determined, we have to determine what is the state share and what is the local share. Here's how we determine that. So we've got the total pie determined. How much pie do they need? How much of that pie is going to be state share, local share? This is where your valuation by town comes in. Who likes their town valuation? Yeah. Maine, write this down, Maine Revenue Service determines the town valuation that we use in the EPS formula. They provide us every year what the town valuation is for each town in the state of Maine. One thing we do to try to even out those of us that live in towns that are having significant increases in valuation lately, the formula uses either a 3-year average or the most recent town valuation, whichever is less. So if your valuation is going down, I don't know who that is, but I might want to move there, we will use that. If it's going up, we'll use the 3-year average, whichever is lower, because the higher the valuation in the formula determines that you have a higher ability to contribute towards education. Again, we get the valuation from MRS. Now the mill expectation. This mill expectation is the cap, the most that any town in Maine will be asked to contribute toward education in this year. This has nothing to do with the mill expectation on your property tax bill. They are not the same, okay? This is different. This mill rate, again, is the most any town will be asked to contribute toward education in this year. It changes every year. Here's how we determine it. Once we've calculated the total cost of education for every school administrative unit, similar to Augusta, which is 31 million. We've got the total cost, I don't have it here, which is 2.6 billion in 26. 2.6 billion total cost. Remember I showed you that slide earlier with the pie? Pecan is the state share. 2.6 billion total cost. Take out the state share, 55%. 1.4 billion. That leaves 1.1 billion that we need to collect from locals toward education. So, based on the valuations that we're using from each town and the total that we need 1.1 billion from locals to cover the 45% of the total cost, what is the lowest mill rate we can use to get that 1.1 billion? In FY26, we were able to have the mill rate be 6.1. That's the lowest we could make it to get to that 1.1 billion that we needed. So that's the most any town will have to contribute, will be asked to contribute. By the way, when they contribute, it doesn't come to the state, it goes to their SAU for their education in their town. Okay? So the contribution that's required is going to you, to your SAU. In order to receive state subsidy, an SAU must contribute the amount asked for or required in the formula. However, locally you can decide not to. If you decide you don't want to raise as much as what EPS is requiring, you have that choice. However, the lesser amount that you raise, whatever that percentage is less than was required, that's also the amount we're going to reduce your state funding. Let's say the required amount is $100,000. Locally you say, we can't afford that. We're only going to do $90,000. Well, so that's 10% less than what the required contribution is according to the formula. So the state portion, let's say that was $200,000, is also going to go down by 10%. We're only going to give you $180,000 instead of $200,000 because you're only contributing $90,000 instead of $100,000. That's the way statute is written. In order to receive the full amount of state funding calculated, you must contribute the full amount required in EPS. Now, most SAUs end up, as I say here, contributing more than what EPS says because your budget is actually higher than the amount that is being funded through EPS. And so there's usually, you do the state required, and then you also have additional local on top of that. So that rarely comes up, but I wanted you to be aware of it. I'm not going to go into this one, but this is talking about the additional local and the SAUs that do end up providing more and those, how much they provide. I'm not going to spend much time on that because we just don't have time. Getting back to the state and local share, I've already gone through this. The total cost, the fiscal capacity or the ability to contribute, the mill rate cap. Again, it comes down to equity in how much the state is going to provide. The state appropriation is the total cost minus the required local contribution, which is going to be different for every SAU. Some can do more based on town valuation times the mill rate. Others can do less, which is why not everyone is getting the same amount from the state. Here's where you can see it. This is an example of Augusta, page 4. Here's the number of students. They have 2,096 and a half students. 2-year average. Their total cost of education calculated by EPS, $31 million. Here is their 3-year average or prior year, it's an average, town valuation, $2.1 billion. Multiply that times the mill rate. That is done by taking 6.1 divided by 1,000 times the valuation. So it's $6.10 per every $1,000 of valuation. Okay? That comes to Augusta can afford locally, has an ability to pay. I'm trying to get away from using can afford because I understand that that's not necessarily true. I get that. I'm trying to say ability to pay. So Augusta has the ability to pay towards education based on this criteria that I've explained to you and the mill rate, the cap of 6.1, $13.3 million. So we take the cost minus what they can contribute, and that comes up with $17.8 million is the state share. We do that for every SAU. I'm going to give you an example. This is York. This is an example of a minimum contributor. Here's the difference between what I just showed you for Augusta and what I'm about to show you for a minimum contributor. The cost for York, when we calculated it per EPS, for their 1,500 students. Remember, Augusta had 22,000. York has 1,500. The cost for York came up to 24.6 million. Augusta was 31 million. Okay? Just giving you comparison. Again, the mill rate will never be more than 6.1 for any town. Multiply that times York's valuation of 6 billion. What was Augusta? 2.1 billion. And you come up with York has an ability to contribute per the formula using the same mill rate of 36 million. But their cost calculated is only 24 million. So we're not going to ask them to contribute more than the cost. That would be wrong. So they're only going to be asked to contribute 24 million, which actually means their mill rate went down. They're not contributing 6.1 mils, they're contributing 4.09 mils. But that also means they're not getting anything for state share. Okay? Ultimately, according to the formula, they can afford it all locally. However, there are adjustments given to minimum contributors in the form of, usually, 50% of your special ed allocation. So York is going to get, from the state, 3.6 million, because that's 50% of their special ed allocation, and their local requirement went down by that amount to 21 million, which actually also reduced their mill rate to 3.49. So they're only contributing 3.49 mils in York, and everybody else is capped at 6.1 because their cost was less. But they're still getting 3 million from the state. So if you're a minimum contributor, that is how we're determining your allocation and why you're considered a minimum contributor. You're contributing less than the mill rate cap. 5B has some adjustments. 5C shows you what is your percentage local share and what is your percentage state share. We also put out a document every year that shows all districts. In this case, they are 43% local, 57% state. This is your checkbook where you can see the payments. We collect audits for accountability. The end.
Thanks for watching. For questions about the presentation, contact Paula Gravelle, the Director of Finance for the Maine Department of Education, over the phone or by email. Be sure to like the video and subscribe for more videos from Maine School Management Association. Planting the seeds for Maine's future.